That takes us to item 6B, the Stage 3 drought update.
Mr. Chair, Commissioners, today's drought update is a little different. We will be obviously touching on just a general update, but we're really getting in, as we've been talking about for a while, get into an update to our water supply strategy. As you know, we try to do that twice a year, typically May and then October, November. Go ahead and look at how demands have changed or rainfall has changed over the year and how that's impacted. So that's kind of a larger portion of this presentation.
Mr. Chair, Commissioners, my name is Kelly Dyer. I'm the Water Supply Manager, so I'll be giving the presentation this morning. Good morning. Let's see. Is there a reason? Should I move this? It's not advancing for some reason. Oh, there we go. Okay. Excuse me, technical difficulties there. So our outline will go through the drought status, the demand status, water supply status of each of our water sources, and then we'll walk through the updated water supply strategy. As Mr. Hagmark mentioned, now that the rainy season is over, we have gone through and updated the condition of all of our water sources with the look ahead for the next few years. Our drought status, so pretty much received all the rain we expect for this year. We measure rainfall at Gibraltar and Kachuma, which are our supply sources. We also measure it downtown Santa Barbara, which is where water is used, and rainfall can affect our irrigation demands. In all cases, the rainfall was about 50% of normal, so we had a dry year, and the drought continues. This is a chart that's developed by federal agencies. It's a broad scale chart showing drought conditions across the state, and they have categorized our area as well as Ventura County as a severe drought condition. The city remains in a drought emergency, which we've been in for several years. That was declared in 2014. We really never did have any reprieve in our drought scenario, while other areas of the state have had a little bit of reprieve. So our demand status, our conservation for the month of April was 31% reduction compared with 2013 demands. 2013 is the year that's the metric that's reported to the state on a monthly basis. And our conservation over the last 12 months has averaged at 36%, so that is exceeding our target of 30%. This chart shows our unaudited water sales revenue by month. This is a revenue collected from water rates, and we've been tracking this chart to really to monitor if there's any shortfalls in revenue. As you can see, the month of April was slightly low, the projected, but it is offset by prior months when we were coming in higher. So overall for the year, our revenue is higher than projected. And now for the water supply status. Gibraltar is full. It's at 98% of capacity. The spill ended in late April. It only spilled 280 acre feet, and this was somewhat of a worst case scenario for us in terms of water quality. We didn't get any flushing. So in prior years, when Gibraltar filled and spilled, we had substantial inflows that really cycled through the reservoir and spilled quite a bit of that first flush. In this case, we got the first flush basically just filled up the reservoir and sat there with a tiny amount that spilled over. So the water quality is very challenging. We have high turbidity and TOC, and we will be working hard to try and divert as much as we can to the maximum extent possible while blending with other sources. And so diversions have begun. We're diverting a very small amount right now, and we'll be testing to see if we can increase those diversions at all. Kachuma is at about 40% of capacity. Really no significant inflows to Kachuma for our Kachuma project supplies. Our current allocation for the year is 40%, and the city's supply in Kachuma is 7,100 acre feet. That is made up of carryover from previous years plus this year's allocation. And we are currently working with the other member units to discuss the allocations for next year, which would be decided and come out from the Bureau on October 1st. So we are working on our request for that next year's allocation in the coming months. If conditions remain dry, COME, the emergency pumping facility, which is needed when water levels drop below the intake tower, that will be needed. It's currently projected to that in summer of 2019, the barge would have to be operational at Site 1. COME has been evaluating some options that could postpone the installation of the pilings. In the original contract that we have with Cushman, there were certain criteria on when pilings needed to be installed, and it was projected that we'd have to put the pilings in this year or this summer, and then have the barge operational next summer. There are some options. COME has been working with Cushman on some options that would allow the pilings to be postponed to a lower lake elevation, which buys us some time. It is a change order, I believe, of about $100,000, but that will be presented to COME, and I'm not certain on the number. That's just ballpark from what I remember. And then Janet Gingras, the general manager at COME, has been really working a lot with Bruce Wales. They've been in constant communication with Bruce Wales, the general manager of San Ynez River Water Conservation District. That agency does the downstream releases of their water rights in the summer months, and they've been collaborating really well together, trying to meet the objectives of the Kachuma member units in trying to postpone the costs of the emergency pumping facility while also meeting the objectives of the downstream agencies in meeting their groundwater recharge objectives. And so at this point, Bruce Wales has indicated they would release 10,000 acre feet this summer, which helps buy us some time. And if everything goes as planned, we wouldn't need to install the pilings in the barge until next spring, so we can see what happens for one more year. All of this will be discussed in further detail and decided at COME this summer. For imported water, the city continues to maximize delivery to Kachuma. That's roughly 280 acre feet per month. And currently we have about 1,100 acre feet of imported water stored at Kachuma. We have about 1,000 acre feet in San Luis Reservoir and 100 acre feet in the Palmdale Groundwater Bank. Our allocation from DWR is final. As of May 1st, they allocated 30% of our maximum Table A amount, so that's about 990 acre feet to the city. Since we have an objective of keeping the pipe flowing full, we did pursue supplemental water purchases in the amount of 1,500 acre feet for this year and executed an agreement with Mojave Water District for an exchange, and that the price of that exchange was $320 per acre foot for the purchase cost. So we paid $500,000 to receive the 1,500 acre feet. It's a 4-to-1 exchange, meaning for every 4 acre feet that the city receives, we have to return for every 4 acre feet the city receives, we have to return 1 acre foot. And we have about 10 years to do that. When the water is returned, there is a cost to pay for the transportation to Mojave Water District, and that's at about 250 acre feet. So that adds about $100,000 to the total purchase price. And again, I'm sorry?
I'm sorry. So you said in order to keep up our piece of the pie, the capacity, we're bringing that water in. Is that what you said?
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Jordan, that's correct. This agreement has yet to be approved by DWR, but we've all agreed between the agencies participating it, CCWA and Mojave Water District have all agreed on the terms, and now we just are waiting final approval from DWR before we could execute that exchange. What happens the exchange occurs at San Luis Reservoir, so it is secure water. It doesn't have to pass through the delta, and then we can start delivering it at any time after DWR
so
approves.
If your source is somewhere else, reduce what you're using in that slice of the pie and the pipe coming into Kachuma, do you automatically lose that? They will give it to somebody else. So we have whatever that percentage is, the 1/5 percentage of that pipe or whatever it is. We have to keep using that in order to so you always have to have a source out there to keep the pipe going to the most we can use it.
That's correct.
Wow. Okay. Thanks.
That also works the other way. If someone doesn't have any water to deliver, that excess capacity becomes
So how
available.
does that get resolved among the other 3 or 4 people?
There's a very clear process laid out by CCWA.
okay.
So if you run out of water, don't have any water to deliver, then the excess capacity gets basically shared with those who do have water to deliver.
Okay. Thanks.
Barry, in terms of returning water eventually, is it possible some of this water can be returned in San Luis Reservoir rather than physically delivered to Mojave?
That's essentially where the exchange would occur, I believe, and then Mojave would take it from San Luis to their.
But we still have the cost of transporting it.
We would have to pay for the transportation costs. That's correct. So our water debt, accounting for this Mojave exchange, would go up to 3675 acre feet. It's not as high as it's been before. We're upwards over 5,000 acre feet of water debt in previous years. And again, we have about 10 years to pay that off. Our groundwater wells, we are preparing some of our wells, maybe about 3 out of the 9 for potential production this summer. That's going to depend on how much Gibraltar water we can use. As I mentioned, the water quality is challenging. So we may be bringing our groundwater wells online depending on how things go with Gibraltar.
Just a question, and I can't find it now, but here it is. We indicate that our groundwater levels are at historic lows, and we've talked about resting it, and yet here we are talking about ramping them back up. Mm-hmm. You want to talk just a little bit about resolving the difference between at historic lows and basically hitting them again?
Mm-hmm. Mr. Chair, we still have some remaining yield in our groundwater basins. We do modeling working with the USGS we have a very detailed numeric groundwater model of our basins, and there is remaining yield we could pump out. And our planning horizon for the next few years, we would limit our pumping to the remaining yield that we anticipate in storage. So there's about 30% of the drought yield remaining, and at that point we would assume it's not available anymore. In the downtown basin, storage unit 1, the water levels have actually already recovered, and in some areas it's artesian conditions. That basin is under pressure, so it's very responsive to pumping and can quickly rebound, but the issue is seawater intrusion. So we don't want to, our boundary for seawater intrusion is the 101. So we've been monitoring it, and as long as it doesn't pass the 101, we would continue pumping. Once it passes that point, we would, I think, be shutting our wells down.
Have we noticed increase in seawater intrusion into that zone?
We have. It's about, we've seen chlorides increase at the point roughly halfway between the shoreline and 101.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, Commissioners, just a little update on the Desal plant. So it is in full operation, and each month it seems that they're able to eke out a little bit more performance, which is great. We went to City Council on May 1st and got approval to enter into a funding agreement, a second amended part of the funding agreement, which is basically our agreement with Montecito to share in the cost of negotiations. And so we actually had our first meeting on Monday. It was a 5-hour marathon to try and get through some of these issues, and I feel like we're making really good progress. We've set out a pretty aggressive schedule to try and wrap up the terms of the agreement by the end of July and make those publicly available, talk about those, and then try and come back in October, November timeframe with a final water sales agreement. So that's generally where we're going. The big ticket item that we have yet to really get into is the conveyance pipeline, and that's the part that could be a major cost. And as part of the council's action, they awarded a contract to Carollo to restart that design work that they were working on, and so we're hoping that we'll have at least a 60% design costs from Carollo by the September timeframe, because that's really important. Right now we're using a $7 to $12 million costs for the conveyance pipeline, at least the new section that needs to be put in, but we definitely needed to do some more work to refine that. So that's where we are with that.
Chairman?
Barry?
So if there was a deal to deliver water, that would be part of our current 3125 acre foot production?
No, I mean, the challenge here is we have to make the findings that we have excess water, and currently we don't have any excess water. And so part of this agreement going forward is that we would need to expand the facility to really create this excess supply to have for sale, and or changes need to happen in our weather patterns to make it so that 3125 provides excess water. So that's something that it's going to be kind of left open, and that really changes the parameters of their participation. If the Desal plant remains at 3125 and they become a partner and it rains and there's enough capacity, they would be a 40%. They would share 40% of the costs. They're not going to be owners, but there would be a 40% cost sharing. If we expand the facility, their cost sharing goes down to 25%. So it's a big swing depending on what we do with this. And so Montecito is very eager hopefully for us to expand it, because that really changes their costs.
Is this the section for a question on city adding production capacity, or is it the next agenda item?
Next
Okay.
item.
I'll hold off till then. Thanks.
All right, so recycled water, we haven't had this slide in for a while, but I wanted to remind everyone that we do have recycled water supplies that are an important part of our supply mix, and the plant continues to operate at about 1.7 MGD. That is expected to increase once the secondary aeration project is complete, and that's wrapping up in early 2019. At that point, we think that the capacity would go up to 3 MGD and supply about 1,400 acre feet per year. Our current demands are less than that. They're range between 800 and 1,000 acre feet per year. The plant is meeting all of the demands on the system, so we have not had to use non-potable groundwater, and we haven't had to do any blending of potable water. So our recycled water plant is meeting all of our current demands for recycled water.
And just a clarification too, and this can be confusing. So a 3 MGD facility is about 3,000 acre feet a year if it's run at full capacity year round. And certainly we have the recycled water to do that. We just don't have the demands to do that, and nobody wants any recycled water in the winter. So therefore, it kind of leads us to the kind of the design capacity being about 1,400 acre feet a year, because everybody wants it in the summer and nobody wants it the rest of the year. Should you find a source or someone who had an interest in recycled water during the winter, certainly the facility has a capacity greater than 1,400 acre feet a year. I don't know if that helps, but that's just kind of clarifying some of that confusion about how the facility is sized and how it works.
Chris?
Is part of that demand tied to the ability to get the recycled water? I mean, if the pipes don't go, I mean, I'm sure there would be people who would use recycled water to water in the winter. We have pretty dry winters generally.
Yeah, we completed a study, was it 2009, that looked at our recycled water system and the potential for expansion. And, anyone who's adjacent to the current recycled water backbone, we had been encouraging to hook up, but it gets very costly to expand the system, and that's kind of where, especially given where we were financially, we've kind of put it into that because it just didn't pay to expand it when we're talking about the cost of expanding the system, and so that was kind of the challenge.
So in terms of where it's available, is the demand high? And just, like when we're measuring how available it is or what the demand is, I mean, the demand is a little bit related to the availability of it. The demand might actually be higher.
The demand is strong in the summer, and that's the challenge with it. We've got plenty of demand. La Cumbra Mutual Water Company is interested in connecting, but right now we don't have that excess capacity in the summer to provide them. But as I tell them, we've got plenty of water for you in the winter. If you're interested from October through May, we've got plenty of water we can provide.
The 1,400 is based on our planned demands in the long-term water supply plan. So our long-term water supply plan projected that we would increase our non-potable recycled water use from 1,000 to 1,400, and it would require expanding the non-potable distribution system to achieve that. We've, in the drought, been postponing those expansions because we've been more focused on the drinking water supplies and the cost of providing drinking water, and also with potential for potable reuse in the future. We want to, I think, evaluate that opportunity against expanding our non-potable system before we would move forward. Okay, so on to our updated water supply strategy. I just wanted to give some background on the basis of our strategy. The city has an adopted long-term water supply plan, which is a policy document that provides guidance on our management decisions during a drought, how we manage our resources, and the actions that we would take. The long-term water supply plan shows it's a long-term plan through 2030, and over time, conservation efforts really keep our demands down. It projected our demands would decrease over time, even with an increase in population. So that was an important and big part of the plan. It was also based on the worst drought of record, 1947 to 52, which is now the second worst. We've had more extreme dry conditions as well as a longer drought in what we've been experiencing currently. We also have a water shortage contingency plan. This is a plan that's required by the state every 5 years, and it outlines how we would reduce our demands when there's a shortage. So we have 3 levels of drought, 3 levels of water shortage, and we're currently in the highest level, stage 3. And it outlines how we would get to our planned demand reductions depending on the circumstances we were facing. And it also includes reactivation of the desalination facility to address shortages during droughts. And just a summary of some of the actions that are outlined in our policy documents. We would increase our groundwater pumping. That's really a drought and emergency supply for us. We increase our use of the state water project, also considered a drought supply for the city. We would move forward with demand reductions. That's achieved through adjustments to water rates. We have a tiered rate structure, so as people use less water, we need to make adjustments in the pricing in order to still meet our revenue requirements. We would implement regulations as needed. And during the current drought, there's really 3 circumstances when we've moved forward with regulations, and that has been if the community is not achieving the conservation target, we would move forward with the regulations. If the state's requiring or mandating certain regulations, we adopted those. And then lastly, if we're facing a near-term shortage that we were projecting within the next year, and it was absolute that we needed to reduce demands, it would be something we would ask of the community as a short-term circumstance. We've also increased our outreach substantially during the drought. Our water conservation team has had constant messaging throughout the last several years. And again, Desal, that is our emergency water source, and we have completed reactivation of phase 1, which is 3125 acre feet per year. And I wanted to just show a chart comparing what was in the long-term water supply plan versus what we've experienced recently. On the left is the long-term water supply plan. And a couple of key things really, there are a couple of key elements. So this is our Kachuma water supplies, the dark blue. And in the 47 to 52 drought, there was some inflows to Kachuma, to the extent that we actually could have received an allocation every year for this 6-year period. And it would have had allocations reducing by 20% each year. You can see in the current drought, by the time we got to the 4th year, we were at a 45% allocation. We actually had a 0 allocation one year, and now we've had 40% allocations. For the last 4 years, we've really had very minimal, if any, Kachuma supplies compared with what was planned in the previous drought. The other key distinction is in our long-term water supply plan, it was actually a policy decision to plan for up to a 10 to 15% shortage during drought. So this was, at the time, we said that's an acceptable level of shortage. We don't need to develop supplies to fill this gap. We'll just manage our demands up to a 15% shortage. In the current drought, because of the significant lack of surface water, we've had to do demand reductions ranging from 20 to 40%, and we're currently at a 30% conservation target. So I just wanted to give a little background on what we've been through compared to what we planned for. And fortunately, we had this policy document that helped guide our decision making, but adapting that decision making to our current conditions of how much surface water we received. So for right now, we've, I guess one other thing I wanted to mention about the chart, this was 6 years of drought that was planned for. We're currently in year 7, and we're now planning 10 years out.
Is this chart available to us in what format, or
I can provide it to you.
actually the whole PowerPoint?
I was wondering the whole PowerPoint in PDF
Yeah.
form.
We post these PowerPoints on the Water Commission website and when the meeting's over.
Okay.
But we can also certainly send you a link to that.
No, we can get the post. I just thanks.
Michael?
So you know the editorial comment I have every time you show this chart, and I'll continue to do it, and that's that I just, especially when you look back at the prior one, and that's that, when are we going to say that I'm not conserving this huge percentage of water based on 14,000 acre feet a year, but my new norm is, let's say, 11, and we're going to ask you to conserve 10% off of 11, because 11 is really all we're ever going to see again as a potential, possibly. I mean, when do we get there or have that discussion or worry about it? Or do we eventually just get to 80% conservation goal?
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Jordan, that's a great point. And Madeline Ward, our water conservation supervisor, is currently working with a consultant, Madaus, to update our demand projection model. And that's exactly one of the conversations going on, is what is our new normal after the drought subsides. They're looking through demand projections through 2050. And so once we have that information, that would be incorporated into a future long-term water supply plan update, which we're hoping to initiate in the near future. And that's when it becomes our part of our new planning.
And it ties with, I think, the slide that's always in, that we always see maybe in the next report, or we see frequently, that shows after the conservation efforts in the 1990s drought, what we rebounded to. We never rebounded back up to using 14,000 square feet a year. We rebounded up to whatever it was, right? We only rebounded up to that, and I anticipate we will do the same thing here. We'll only rebound up to maybe using 11,000 acre feet a year too, and that should, again, be the top of that chart.
I agree with you. I don't think our demands will rebound to what they were before this drought. What happens is eventually we have demand hardening, however, and there's less and less discretionary use. And so being able to achieve a 50% reduction from your base becomes harder and harder to achieve.
Thanks.
Just as an update too, Kelly and I got to spend a lot of time in the car going up to the Aqua Conference last week, and one of the things that we were exploring is, when to pull the trigger on the update to the long-term water supply plan. And so what we've kind of landed on is this coming fiscal year, basically drafting up, and I think she's already started drafting, if not done with it, the kind of the general description of what are the services, professional services that we needed to support this effort, and with the goal of, by this time next year, putting that out for out to the consultants, and ultimately looking to award a contract in the beginning of, would that be fiscal year 2020? So next summer, awarding the contract and getting going on it, regardless of whether the drought is over or not, just because we can start this discussion, and Kelly has some ideas on how we can kind of structure it, even though we're going to have a lot of unknowns potentially, how we can kind of structure it so that we could come back and update it as those information comes in later.
Some of the things we were waiting for is the drought to end, but we may need to just assume it's going to continue for a few more years. And then also more information on the state water rights order and the Kachuma biological opinion and how that might affect our water supplies. If those processes are not final by the time we start our long-term water supply plan, we could run some scenarios just to get a range of really how sensitive our strategy might be to various scenarios that come out of those processes. So that's where we're at this point in terms of timing. And then it could potentially feed into our 2020 urban water management plan.
Yeah, I was just going to mention that too. We kind of need to have this in place so we can update that, because that's right around the corner.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we're on the same page, and then you just say we're waiting for the drought to end, because I get in trouble with this at home too. I'm just too black and white. But after how long do we say we're not in a drought anymore? Really, that's the whole point of my problem with this thing, is we're not in a drought anymore. Maybe we're not in a drought anymore. And so after how many years do you say we're not in a drought, and you just move on with the new normal? To me, as a consumer, when I see that year, couple years out with the additional conservation red bar, I just say, what the heck? That number is getting too big. To me, I need personally, I need a recalibration where I recognize the last several years was the norm, and now I need to pony up another 10% and stop what I've been doing already, but gain a little more, right? Change behavior a little more, because when I see 40% or 50%, it's just like, whatever. I mean, it's unfathomable to me how to improve upon what I've been doing to chase a big number like that. I really want to recalibrate my behavior at a new baseline and then improve a little more.
So I'm going to go into that particular chart in a little more detail on the following slides, but it is a worst case. What you're seeing here was what is the worst case scenario, and once we get that far out, it can be somewhat speculative because we're assuming no inflows to Gibraltar, no inflows to Kachuma. I'm hoping in the next 3 years, the next 3 winters, we get something. But I hear your point about the new normal and what that means.
You get rain, but you also get a biological opinion. So it's a little bit of both.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and you take California's worst wildfire and you take that out of the mix, and then Gibraltar becomes a reservoir that we actually could drink. It makes our projections look even better. I mean, we really have been thrown some really interesting twists as part of this whole drought cycle that have made.
Krista?
I think we're always going to be thrown interesting twists because everything has become extreme now. And I wonder about if we could just at least maybe start with the language of not saying when we are out of this drought. I think that's I don't see any indication. I mean, I don't know what indication anybody else has that is actually going to happen or that we count on that, but just plan on what the current situation is. I mean, in the past, we looked at the previous 5 years or previous however many years to make your projections for the future. So it seems to me that we're going sort of way back to look at what normal is, and that's to Commissioner Jordan's point too. I think that just in the language that we use, anytime I hear when we're out of this drought, I think, what do you mean? Like it doesn't. Just the perception of that, and I think when you say worst case scenario, I think that's our scenario. That's not our worst case scenario. That's given what we know in the last 5 years. That's what we have to go on. I don't know, just in the languaging of it.
And maybe we start measuring. Maybe we start measuring extreme wet years rather. It's the extreme rather than the dry.
Chairman Davis reminded me that when we were starting into this drought, I presented some historical data based on tree rings and so forth that indicated that there were maybe 2 or 3 30 to 40-year droughts back in the medieval warm period between 800 and 1200 of our current numbering system of years, whatever it's properly called nowadays. At any rate, those are a lot longer than what we're in right now. So when we talk about worst case, it could be a lot worse. Also, I was going to ask a question regarding the groundwater. If we got about 50% of rainfall in the city this year, however, the downtown basin is pretty much filled up in some areas. The question, and we're still having to worry about chloride intrusion along the coast. Is there a way of quantifying the recharge of the groundwater basin? I presume it's happening mostly at the uphill end where the infiltration tends to happen. But can we monitor particular wells and say that the upper end of the basin is filled up and the lower part isn't, or something like that?
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Keller, we can look at the water levels and see how much rise there was in terms of feet of water level change. I'm not sure how we would estimate the amount of recharge in acre feet. We might be able to come up with some estimates based on assumptions on the infiltration rates at certain streams and looking at how much flow there was at those streams. But we do monitor our groundwater levels at 60. There's 60 monitoring wells throughout our basins where we're looking at the level of increase in water level stored, and that's where we've seen some artesian conditions in certain parts of the basin.
I would think that the mod flow model would allow that kind of calculation to be done.
You're correct. I think that the mod flow model could. Our city staff are not trained on how to run that model. It takes about 6 computers, and you have to hit the start button on a Friday to get the results on a Monday. It's a massive model.
And that's physically in San Diego where it's run?
It's in San Diego. USGS staff have been running that model for us. But we can, I'm happy to reach out to our USGS partners and get their opinion on how much recharge may have occurred this year.
Well, assuming that the production layers are adequately quantified in the ModFlow model, and ModFlow works on head, I think you could calculate the storage changes in those layers based on head observed in the monitoring wells.
Okay.
I mean, I think we've gotten some great data points, whether we wanted it or not. We've gotten some really great data points as a result of the drought and pumping down the basin, and I think really will help the model out in the future.
Thanks.
Okay, so where we are right now, and looking ahead for the next few years, we had a couple of goals in putting together the supply projections. One was to ensure adequate supplies for 2 more years through 2020. So we extended that 1 year from the previous projections that you had seen. And then to delay actions that would have additional financial impacts if we could. So from the supply management side, that would be cost of additional supply, such as expanding desal. On the demand management side, that's the cost of increasing our conservation targets, which leads to reduced revenue and would require some reassessment of our water rates, which are based on our conservation targets. So I have 2 scenarios that I'll be showing. One is a better case, which assumes we can use Gibraltar Water, and in this case, it was assuming a 50-50 blend between what we take from Gibraltar and what we take from Kachuma, which includes state water. And then the second scenario on the next slide will be assuming no use of Gibraltar. So I'll walk through the chart. At the bottom here, we have our purple bar is recycled water. And then here we are in year 7. So we're not planning on using much of our Kachuma supply, which is the medium and dark blue bars. We would carry over our Kachuma allocation for use next year. This light blue bar is the Gibraltar water that we could use. And then the green and orange bar represent imported water. Some of that is already stored in Kachuma. And the green is our 30% allocation for this year. And then the light green is desal. So going forward, we would continue to maximize our delivery of imported water. And assuming we get a less than 100% allocation from State Water Project next year, which is likely, we would have to go out and look for additional supplemental water purchases. In these projections, we've assumed a 35% allocation of state water, so we'd have to purchase the other 65%. So looking out to 2021, and this is, by the time we get out to 2021, it's somewhat speculative. We've assumed no additional inflows to Gibraltar and no additional inflows to Kachuma. And then under that case, our shortage is about 800 acre feet. And I think that's something that we could address next year or the following year to fill that gap. In the other scenario where we can't use Gibraltar, there was one color I forgot to mention, which is the yellow bar. So the yellow is our groundwater. If we're able to use Gibraltar, we don't need to turn on our wells this summer. If we can't use, we could actually hold off on turning on our wells and use them in later years of the drought. This is that remaining drought yield that we anticipate to have.
Kelly, there's no dark blue Kachuma, no base load from Kachuma?
That's because we've assumed no additional inflows to Kachuma, which means no allocations.
Right.
So all that we would have is water we've carried over from previous years. In this scenario, where we can't use as much Gibraltar this year, we would start to turn on some of our wells. We've looked at turning on about 3 out of the 9 and start using some of our groundwater sooner than later. This increases that gap in 2021 by about 500 acre feet. It's still a manageable amount, and I think we could easily address that next year or the following year in order to fill the gap. So in summary, our supply is sufficient through 2020. The level of shortage in 2021 would depend on how much Gibraltar water we can use this year and whether we get any rainfall and inflows next winter. So decisions that have additional financial impacts, such as increasing the conservation target or expanding desal, can be postponed until next year. And I'm happy to take any questions on that.
So backing up to both of those slides on does the carryover colors for Kachuma, is that basically then in either one of those scenarios run through all the 7,100 acre feet we have up there right now? It basically exhausts it if we assume no inflow to Kachuma.
Correct.
And does that number that's available get hurt by whatever happens with the biological order?
These projections assume status quo under the current biological opinion.
That would be an optimistic projection, right?
Actually, I don't think so because we're assuming zero allocations. So
Okay.
even if a buyout came out,
Zero's out.
it's zero. There's no change. We're assuming zero allocations.
So in either one of those projections, we're basically saying in a worst case scenario that there's no inflow to Kachuma, we basically lose any aspect of Kachuma as a storage facility for just inflow. It's only what we can bring into the lake.
Our position is our carryover has already been allocated and is under our ownership at that point, and it's protected from releases downstream for fish.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Megan.
Going back to the water debt, it's not very big now, which is great. You mentioned kind of at the end, like, oh, we've got 10 years to pay off this debt. I know that with the current contract, it would be 10 years, but there's some older water that I'm guessing is going to be due sooner. I don't need the details of it. My only thought is that as we get out here and what we did at the beginning of this drought is we bought a bunch of water, and that allowed us to delay desal for a couple years. And I'm assuming that's going to be on the table again as ramping up those water purchases. So I think as we get to those discussions, knowing when our current water debt is due and in what amounts will help us plan for future water purchases. So just something to include as we start talking about water purchases again is a little bit more details on when that water debt is due would be helpful.
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Burney, I'd be happy to put those up there. We have multiple agreements, and so CCWA has been tracking that for us. DWR has said that we can extend the terms of when it's paid back if there are extraordinary circumstances, such as an extended drought period. So it's a great point, and I think we are tracking it through CCWA. I'm happy to try and pull a slide together that shows all the various purchases we have and when they're due. It might be a little detailed because we have so many of them.
Yeah, and this isn't a short-term thing. It's more like when we're looking for next year, when we start doing the water supply planning again, just starting to think about that as we come back to that again, but not a short-term thing. And I realize it's not a ton of water, but if we all of a sudden are 10 years out and are like, oh yeah, we bought all that water 10 years ago, and it's kind of what we've been talking about with the language here, like we're still in a drought. Like this drought isn't actually going to be over now. What do we do? And how does that also impact our planning for buying more water? Because we assume in the next 10 years it's going to be wet. What if it's not? How do we return that water? So just things that we think we should think about. And I just want to kind of second Councilmember Steddon's comment. I think we're always in a drought. I think that becomes our language, is that it's not, I have people ask me that all the time. Are we still in a drought? I'm like, yes, we are always in a drought. We are in a drought-prone area. You should always assume we're in a drought. You'll know if we're not. But I think that is important that we stop, we kind of start talking about it as like we are a drought-prone area. That's going to be what we should assume is going to happen from here on out. Okay, thank you.
Good. Any other questions? Good, thank you, Kelly.